Thank you, everyone, for coming out today on a Sunday afternoon that at least about an hour ago was still very rainy and gloomy. As she said, I'm Sarah Harrelson. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Cultured Magazine. We have focused a lot of our coverage on underrepresented voices in the creative fields. And I have covered a very wide range of collectors for about 7 or 8 years. I just want to take a quick second. She did a lovely job introducing. You can understand the incredible talent that I'm sitting with. I feel so lucky to be sitting here with you guys today. But I just want to start by reading a little bit about what the three of you, how you've contributed, and then we'll get started with hopefully a very lively discussion. The collectors here today have amassed singularly important and encyclopedic collections of contemporary art. But what makes them all unique is their vital and dynamic contributions to culture. Like patrons of the past, they are great listeners, have responded in real time to the needs of the art world. They have addressed the vast inequities in the art world faced by women artists, artists of color, working across market prices, museum acquisitions, and overall visibility in the art world. You have all reimagined what it means to be a patron in your own way, and you have made incredible investments in artists of the future through your gifts to education and institutions. You all are exceptionally determined and well-informed collectors, and I'm so pleased to have you here today. Thank you to the Armory for asking me to moderate today. So, I wanted to start by asking each of you how you got into the art world. We can start with Sarah or George, but I want to start with start collecting. How did you find your way to the art world?
Ladies first.
Thank you. Thank you. You really threw me under the bus there. So this is actually the last place that I ever thought I was going to be. My entire life, I was like very much into math, science. I was on math team. I was pre-med my first 2 years of college. I had a lot of people in my family who were either artists or very involved in the arts, and so of course, as an act of rebellion, I decided to go just straight math and science. But my grandparents founded an organization called Young Arts in 1981, and I was 19. It was my sophomore year. It was holiday break, and I went with my grandmother to a Young Arts Gala, not because I was interested, just because I wanted to spend time with Grandma.
And get dressed up.
And get dressed up and wear a fabulous dress. And one of the mothers, so we identify and support the greatest artists across all disciplines, visual, literary, performing design arts in high school, and we try to provide them a lifetime of support to pursue education and careers in the arts. And one of the mothers of the winners that night approached me in the visual arts and said, I guess she had heard that I was part of the family who had founded the organization, and she said, I have to thank you and your family so much. My son has been coming home from school and drawing, and I would yell at him to go do his real work, his math, his science, his English. And seeing him here, being mentored by luminaries in his field, being looked at by universities for scholarships for his artistic work, I realized that I should support him and that this is his real work. And I had a moment of, this organization is not only so impactful for the artists that it identifies and supports, but it's also very impactful for people to recognize the value of artists in our society and support that. And I was kind of the only one in the family who had really had any engagement or interest in it, and I realized that unless I got involved, the organization would probably die. And I think that it's really vital because of recognizing artists across discipline and because of the early point at which it recognizes artists and recognize its importance in the ecosystem. And so literally the next morning, I knocked on my grandmother's door and I said, Grandma, I would like to get involved. I would like to help. And changed my major from biology, where I was heading to be a geneticist, to a double major in business and French with a minor in art history. And moved to New York after college, started getting involved in a lot of organizations in the city, and the rest is history.
Thank you. Komal?
So I'm going to say that I'm so proud to be the senior in the room, or senior on this platform.
By about a year.
Literally.
Hey, senior. I think that I feel like we've all ended up in the art world through sort of various reasons. In my case, it was great friends. Two friends specifically, Pamela Joyner and Dipti Mathur, both older to me by a few years, and who decided that as I retired from work to take care of our 6-year-old, that what I should do is really start looking at art. And I think for a few years, I actually wasn't quite sure what the hell I was doing. But there were some pivotal moments where it became obvious to me that I was in love. And then it also became obvious to me that the balance between male and female artists was very askew. And eventually that became the mission of the collection. But to take a step back, I only came to the US to study computer science at 32 years ago at the age of 21. And I was one of 3 women studying computer science at Stanford at that time. And I actually did wonder, I always thought of the US as being the place where, it's the most advanced in equality, in parity. And so I said, why are there so few women? I mean, there were more women in engineering in India than in the US. So it was a bit of a puzzle, but only as a mother, I've really gotten to realize how different and difficult it is for women to succeed.
George?
Hi. My path to the art world was very indirect. So as I was introduced, I founded a company called Wells Group of New York, which does finance and accounting consulting primarily for high-growth companies, really working with entrepreneurs who are visionaries and are trying to change old industries and make them new using technology. I was working with the Lehman family of Lehman Maupin on a technology investment, nothing to do with the art world, and they had turnover with the CFO at the gallery. And for those of you that don't know, Lehman Maupin is a global art gallery with a gallery here in Chelsea, one in Hong Kong, Seoul, pop-up in Palm Beach, and has done pop-ups in Aspen. And I thought, well, why would you want me, a sort of vocational finance guy, to come in and work at your gallery? And they really were adamant about it because they had seen my work over the course of a couple of years through a very different circumstance. Anyway, I joined Lehman Maupin and worked with them for 2 years, really knowing nothing about art at all. But I was lucky, and I feel like God intervened, because some of the most important artists working today are represented or have been represented by the gallery. Artists like Mickalene Thomas, who Sarah just hosted a lovely brunch for.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I just want to say your role in the art world is so paramount. I think your coverage is so great, and I'm honored that you chose me to be on this platform today.
Thank you.
But artists like Mickalene Thomas, Teresita Fernandez, who has a large-scale work just outside this room, Dohosa, a very diverse roster of artists. And it really was an encounter with the Mickalene Thomas painting, one of Whoopi Goldberg, and it was informed by the film Color Purple, and it was a paramount scene to the film where Whoopi was crying in the rain, and Mickalene captured that moment in the film in such a special way. And that's really when art became more than just objects on the wall that I didn't understand why someone would pay $300,000 for, to something deeply personal to me, because Color Purple is my favorite movie. And from there, the rest is history.
Do you know that Mickalene just went and shot the new cast for The Color Purple, which is coming out in December?
You're always teaching me something new.
And the director is also a painter. I know you're
Wow.
going to ask me his name. I can't remember his name, but anyway, more on that later. Thank you for setting the stage and how you each entered the art world, and incredible to hear these really personal stories. And now I would like to talk a little bit about, now we've set the stage for you to be interested in the art world. I want to talk a little bit about your first acquisition, and then your last acquisition, and how, and please let us know the amount of time that is in between, and then how it kind of, exemplifies either your growth as a collector or any kind of, trajectory, I mean, even, I know, Sarah, for you, it's at least a decade, the art world has changed. So I'd love to hear your first, your last, and how it's changed you, and how you think back on it. We can, whatever you guys want.
The first real piece of art I was given is kind of after when I started expressing interest. I started traveling with my grandmother in France, and we ended up. We started at the Musée d'Orsay, seeing the Impressionists, and the curator we were walking through with said, if you're interested, you can go to Giverny, which is where, Monet lived and painted. You can go see Daubigny's place, where he, on rainy days, painted inside on his walls. And so we kind of ended up accidentally on this trek from, Paris down kind of through following the lives, careers, and relationships of the Impressionists. And I think that gave me a much greater understanding, I think particularly the letters written between Vincent van Gogh and his brother Theo, a greater understanding of what it meant to be an artist, the emotions, the difficulties that they faced at that time and which carry on until now. And after 2 summers of this, she gifted me a painting by Eugène Boudin. And so that Boudin is the one non-living artist, I think, that I have in my collection, but it is the only piece of art in my bedroom and kind of symbolizes my entry into the art world, my relationship with my grandparents, the work that they did. So that's something that, while I personally didn't acquire it, was really my first piece of art and I think symbolizes a lot. The first piece of art that I purchased was an artist who I met early in her career, Zoe Buckman. A lot of you probably know her. And it was her first solo show, and it was at a gallery on Bowery that is no longer here, called Garrison. I think they moved to LA. And it was a large-scale photograph that she did. And, through that, we had some mutual friends. I met Zoe. I got to know her. She became a young arts master teacher. We ended up doing a lot of things together over the years, and I followed her career. So, that was her first solo show. I purchased a piece there. Then she had, I remember she had an installation at Pulse Art Fair, which is no longer in existence, but in Miami. And so, went down there to see that. She had a solo show at Fort Gansevoort in Meatpacking. She just had a show at Pippi Holdsworth in the UK, and so I felt like, and along the way I would keep acquiring. So the first was a large-scale photograph. The next was a ceramics piece when she was kind of experimenting with ceramics for her Fort Gansevoort show. Then when I first found out I was pregnant with my first daughter, one of the first things I did was to start an art collection for her. Which was really fun. And so I bought a Zoe piece, that kind of one of her embroidery pieces, which is kind of a lot what she's doing now, that had, I think, a lot of meaning from a maternal standpoint. And then another piece from the Pippi show. And so I think that is a really good example of how I collect, of meeting an artist, getting to know them in some capacity, and then kind of following along their journey and their career. And that is something that I think is really exciting, that every piece there's a story, so that my collection is almost autobiographical. One of the most recent pieces I acquired is an artist, Ilana Savdi, who just opened a show at the Whitney Museum. And I had gotten to know Titus Kaffar and his residency in New Haven, Next Haven, which is an absolutely incredible program. Had connected with them, felt like there were a lot of similarities between the work he was doing and the work Young Arts was doing. And Titus and his the residents that year ended up doing a Young Arts masterclass. And when I went down to visit the residents, I met Ilana, and I spent time with her in her studio there at Next Haven, kept in touch with her. She came back to the city. I did a studio visit with her in Brooklyn, and then she opened her first solo show at Kong Gallery in LA. And I purchased a piece from there. And so I think both of those stories are very much how I approach collecting. It is very long-term. It is very personal. If you look at my collection, there's kind of, it doesn't seem like there's any rhyme or reason, but every single one of them, there's a relationship, there's a story. We've worked on something together, and so it's very personal.
Do you own any artists you don't know?
Maybe 3, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Komal?
Okay, so I think I'm just thinking about the answer here. And it's going to be about friends for this particular question as well. Because in 2011, my friend Dipti Mathur takes me to New York, brings me to New York to see the South Asian Auction Week and to meet everybody involved in the South Asian community. After all, I'm Indian, and I should be collecting works by Indian artists. So we get to the auction. I had no idea how auctions work. So of course, I didn't know that one had to register interest and get set up to bid in the auction. I'd seen a work by Reena Banerjee, who calls herself a New Yorker, even though she's of Indian origin. And I had just fallen in love with this very beautiful, poignant painting. It was a work on paper. And when we were sitting in the auction room, I noticed nobody was bidding on it. Now, as an experienced collector now, I feel like I would have read that differently, but at that moment, it was, well, if nobody is bidding for it, I'm going to do it. And so I had to ask my friend Dipti to raise her paddle for me. I still love that work very much. So my suggestion, in case you haven't started collecting, is to find some rich friends. And so Christie's has a footnote in there where the work is in our collection, but it was Dipti who raised her paddle. And the last work that we acquired also is a story of bad friends. There's this very wonderful dealer called Jose, and I was walking through the halls of Armory 2 days ago, and he pulls me in and he says, Komal, you really need to look at this work. And so I land at this gallery called A Palazzo, based in Italy, and they were showing work by Sonia Boyce. Now, I had been to her UK pavilion last year, but then somehow, just with that nudge, I started getting to learn about the work that was available. And the Venice Pavilion's available. For me, I think what got my attention was the series of 75 plates. It's a triplet set, so 25 times 3. She did this experiment in '95 in the UK, where she basically had an open call. You could come have her take a photo of you in one day. The condition was that you would also have to wear an afro and be photographed. So she wanted you to experience what it meant, right? And so it's sort of the name, the person as they walked in, and then the person in afro. And then, of course, she has imbued color into this display as well. And so that work really got my attention and moved me. And so that was the latest acquisition, which I haven't paid yet, but I'm counting it in.
I don't think they're worried.
Some rich friend will help me out.
I was about to say, call a rich friend. Have a day.
That's great. So I think I already explained earlier how Lehman Maupin was my apprenticeship in art collecting. But some of the best elements of discovery have been at art fairs, through museums, through gallery walks, and of course through press. The first work that I actually purchased was a Neri Ward diptych called Status in the Ball Crown. And for those of you that don't know Neri Ward, he takes repurposed objects and creates both beautiful objects, but those that are deeply meaningful and curatorial. Most of them surround colonialism, slavery, and black empowerment. The work is called Status and the Ball Crown, and it's painted over trading cards, Knicks trading cards, that depict a king's armor and a queen's crown. And it's a really beautiful object that I encountered when I was in a conference. I was in a conference room with Rochelle Lehman, a very well-known collector at Lehman Maupin, and I saw through the glass window this artwork, and I thought, wow, it's so beautiful. I couldn't tell if it was leather. I couldn't tell what it was, but it really looked like a king's armor and a queen's crown. And I was like, I've got to have that. I've got to see it closer. And then Rochelle really was a big mentor in my art collecting, and I was like, should I get this work? I think I should get this work. And I think I remember talking to my husband, Manfred, who's in the audience here, about buying works, and the idea of spending $40,000 on an object was sort of not something we had done before, but I really felt compelled to purchase the work just because of what it symbolizes and what it reminds me of every day when I wake up in the morning and look at the work above our bed. And so it's a very special work to me, and Neri Ward is represented by the gallery and has had a huge museum show here at the New Museum a few years ago that was really groundbreaking, and I just am honored to have him as part of my collection. Like Sarah, I know most of the artists in my collection through this very special vantage point of having worked at Lehman Maupin, but art fairs like the Armory Show are great ways to be introduced to new artists. The most recent work was a work by Quailisha Wood, who recently did a Studio Museum of Harlem residency. And the Studio Museum of Harlem plays such a pivotal role in telling Black stories in the visual arts. And artists like Mickalene, Rashid Johnson, almost every Black artist known today is associated with that organization and the great work that Thelma Golden, the director, has done over the last 20 plus years. And so last year, after the residency, Quailisha Wood, the residency culminates in a show at MoMA PS1 where they give each of the artists that participated in it a room to show their works. And last summer I saw Quailisha Wood's work, and I was really mesmerized by the work, not just because it's aesthetically beautiful, but she uses jacquard textiles to tell very vivid stories about the Black femme experience. And it's interesting because I work with innovative companies, and jacquard actually played a pivotal role in the early computing and actually making clothes en masse. So she uses jacquard as a nod to that, but there's a big influence of technology. So part of the object says, it almost looks like a computer that's frozen, and it says, how when your computer's stuck and it says in process, or the normal buttons, and then in the middle it says repent. So the textile actually looks like almost like a biblical reference, like some of the things, like a Jesus candle, but it's her reimagined in the image. And I love the work because it's a weaving of technology, which plays such a pivotal role in my work, but also the Black female, which I think is really the cornerstone of America in so many ways, and of course in my own life. So Quailisha Wood is definitely someone I recommend looking into. She also had a show with Pippi Holdsworth, and that's where I acquired the work just last month. So those are the first and the last. I try to collect mostly, we don't collect exclusively Black art, we collect Black art, we collect queer art, we collect art that we think is important because we think that context is important for eventually giving all the art to a museum of some sort. So we try to collect a lot of Black and gay art and elevate those voices, but we also collect across all types of artists.
I want to stay with you for a second, actually. It's incredible, and I think you've only been collecting for about 5 years. Is that true?
That's right, just
Yeah.
5 years, almost five. Next
And
month
it's
it'll be
incredible the
5.
contribution that you've made. And I'm curious if you think in the last 5 years there's been any kind of forward momentum, or if there was a particular Black artist or queer artist that you covered that you felt that you brought light to, and you've seen kind of their career trajectory change a little bit in the last couple years.
That's a great question. As you mentioned, I've only been collecting for 5 years, and a lot of the artists in my collection were really mid-career. I think I consider them blue chip because I'm not a billionaire, but blue chip
They're blue
artists. Blue chip, like a lot of Rashid Johnson, a lot of Mickalene Thomas, a lot of Neri Ward, a lot of MacArthur Binion. And I can't say that I played a pivotal role in any of their career, but what I have found myself more drawn to is collecting younger artists like Quailisha Wood, like Teriku Shifaru. And in those artists, I'm hoping to use my standing in the art world to elevate those artists, because I feel like I can have a greater impact. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm involved with the Tate's North American Acquisition Committee. and I'm going to be the co-chair starting in October, and I feel like that's an opportunity to get more artists in dialogue with the Tate as it relates to collecting, exhibiting, and I feel like that's how I can try to play a role. The one thing that maybe wasn't mentioned in the introduction was that I gifted, a promise gift, $1 million art collection. At the time it was $1 million. Now it's much more because of everything that's transpired with black art over the last 5 years. Most of the artists that are in my collection, I can no longer afford.
You're skipping ahead because, of course, we were going to talk about that. But since you brought it up, I think it would be great if you could just talk a little bit about your incredible gift to Morehouse and what was the inspiration behind it. I think you gifted a Rashid, and I don't know if I know the other artists, but I'd love to hear about that. And then we'll go back to you, Komal.
That's great. So one of the things that compelled me to collecting is really the death of my father, which happened 12 years ago. But when he died when I was 32, I almost felt a void in my life, like why work this hard? I can't brag to my dad anymore type of thing. And so art collecting in a way became a source of motivation. And so in 2020, when I started thinking about the Morehouse gift, it was really after the murder of George Floyd. And as someone who, honestly, I grew up watching Fox News, very right-wing. My dad was, a Reagan-type Republican. I had a lot of issues around identity and my own blackness, but seeing George Floyd's murder and then seeing what happened with the Central Park bird watcher, really hit home for me personally. And I was like, you know what? Like, Black Lives Matter is about me too. Like, I'm not removed from this. So after his murder, I wanted to find ways to kind of elevate black voices. And my husband and I were sitting in our house in Bridgehampton, and we were talking to my art dealer about, gosh, what is it going to take to get a Rashid Johnson mosaic tile painting? And then it was like, well, how can I do something about Black Lives Matter and kind of elevating black voices? So those two things came together with the initial ideation around creating the George Wells Morehouse collection, including artists like Rashid Johnson, Amy Sherrow, Gary Simmons, Lauren Halsey, Tamashi Jackson in the collection was a way to elevate black voices and take those voices, because many of those names are not known in the black community, take those voices to Morehouse College, which is a historically black college in Atlanta, and merge my interest in the art world with my interest in building a very important collection, and also doing something for Morehouse that was different, because Morehouse does not have a permanent collection. And when I think about the three pillars of making Morehouse important and its role in America, I think about the education, which is obviously so important. I think of the role in the civil rights movement, which is also important. Martin Luther King is the class of 1948. And then I also think about contemporary art, which was void in that conversation. And the rest is history.
And Komal, you collect mostly women. Your collection has such incredible breadth and intergenerational relationships that a lot of people have said is inspiring a next generation of museum curators and a next generation of artists. Can you talk to us a little bit about when you made that decision to really focus only on women artists, and if you've seen change in the last, I guess, decade since you've started collecting?
Okay, so I'm going to just put out some numbers out there just to frame this conversation. 12% of museum acquisitions between 2008 and 2018 were by women artists. So this is 30 institutions, all very well-known institutions.
And is this US only?
US only, 12%. Guardian reported that women artists earn 10 cents to the dollar. Now, I'm on the board of the Berkeley Business School, and we struggle with 60 to 80 cents on the dollar, right? But I have not seen such a shocking disparity anywhere else other than the art world. And so that's sort of the background, which I have only come to know for the last 10 years. I fell in love. For me, I think that switch, that you become sort of this crazy, obsessed collector, happened in 2014 for me, when I was looking at work in the Whitney Biennial, and Mark Godfrey, who was actually at the Tate as well then, was with us, and I fell in love with works by Laura Owens and Jacqueline Humphreys. So much so that they were masculine and powerful and huge and funny. Laura's work was funny, but very, very accomplished. And I had no idea who any of these artists were, but I absolutely fell in love with the work, and I said, oh my God, I have to go acquire the work. So I certainly helped the Tate acquire both works by Laura and Jacqueline, but I also started to obsess over those artists, and forward a year or two, I have gotten to know them and their peers, Charlene Von Heil, Amy Silman, Dana Schutz, Rachel Harrison, who are all sort of my age. But that really forms now the core of our collection. And for a while, I didn't care about gender. I just loved the work. I was just obsessed. And in a way, I think the idea of these women being so spunky and so creative and fearless is what I was attracted to as well, beyond the work. And as I started getting to know them, I realized that there were all these other people in the room. Mary Heilman, who is now 80 years old, but she was sort of the grand dame of this group, and she would watch at dinners who was entering the collection and who the other artists were. And so I started to literally study networks of influence, along with many curators, about who influenced this generation of artists. And that's when I really started understanding how there was so much disparity, pricing, recognition. The dinners for these women artists. By the way, Charlene just had an opening dinner on Thursday. It was a zoo. But the first dinner I went to had 20 people, right? And it's basically close friends and artists and people that, in the small little bubble that are going to be with you. The artists were all women, and I really felt that the world needs to shift. And I think that in 2014 is when it became very clear, 2014, that if I was going to put my time and money into this, into collecting, into my obsession, that I'd better make a difference. And I had supported, I'm on the board of the Feminist Majority and other, centers for domestic violence. But I felt that if I was going to do this, it had to be about making a difference and a legacy.
I'm going to use one of your quotes, but I'm going to start with you, Sarah. And so you said, I've managed $100 million businesses, and I know what it takes to grow these businesses. And you've applied the same level, you've all applied that same level of commitment to collecting. And you're standing up here and throwing off names, and I'm not sure if people realize how incredible what it is that you've all accomplished. So Sarah, I'm gonna start with you. You are a mother. You are on 100 boards. How do you, tell us what it looks like to kind of be this up on it, make this time for studio visits. It is an incredible commitment to collect the way that you guys are collecting. So I'd love to hear how you do it and how you maintain such a rigorous schedule.
I actually think I'm kind of lucky and in a bit of a different situation than a lot of other trustees of museums because this is my full-time job. As president of Arison Arts Foundation, I get to work with artists all day, every day, which I think, looking back at, as I was talking about my kind of educational history and what I thought my career path was going to be, much better than like being in a lab with a bunch of test tubes. So I think I made the right choice. I think it really is about just being open. My husband, I think, tells me on a daily basis, can you please just say no more often? And I say, no, I can say no to you, but I'm not going to say no to other people. It's the number of times that, I've gotten kind of a cold outreach from an artist or from somebody who worked with an organization, and I'm like, sure, let's have a phone call, let's have a coffee, whatever it is, and it ends up being somebody who, I've ended up working with very closely or with their organization. They may have become a cultural partner for young arts. It's being open, and then, I think I'm in an incredibly privileged position that I get to be on all of these boards and I get to be on all of these committees. And so then taking advantage of being able to do the studio visits. I think some of these collecting committees are an incredible way to discover artists. At MoMA, we have Fund for the 21st Century, which acquires only art made in the past 5 years, only living artists, but it's artists from around the world, from across all disciplines. And so you get to see this incredibly kind of broad cross-section of what living, working artists are doing right now. So I think, one of the silver linings of COVID is that so many cultural institutions really beefed up their online programming and, started doing virtual studio visits, started doing, recording performances and putting them up there. And so the accessibility, if you want to learn more about an artist or a gallery in South Africa, it is there. You can get online, you can do it. They're constantly doing online, panel discussions or studio visits. The accessibility, I think, is very different. I think we're all very lucky. We get to travel to institutions where we want to see the program, and we get to travel for art fairs. That's a very privileged position, and I think that the accessibility, kind of particularly post-COVID, is something that everybody can take advantage of.
And how do you guys keep up the drive and discipline? I've heard famous curators saying that they're even surprised by some of the people that you guys have gone into the studios of. So you really are leading the pack. How do you keep up?
It's interesting. I almost don't even view it as keeping up. I view it as sort of empowering and fueling, working with visual artists who are trying to change the landscape and the discourse and really capture what's happening now is mind expanding, honestly. I think I bring what I learn in an artist studio to my work, creative thinking, and I love it. And actually, one of the things, talking to an entrepreneur that's starting a business that is trying to reimagine an industry and talking to an artist, they're very similar, actually. And I really kind of, like that time at Lehman Maupin dealing with artists, some of whom are known to be very specific, or sometimes people say difficult, actually fuels my business as well, because it's like a tricky situation. How do you word things? And everything is worded so beautifully in the art world, even, from all aspects. So I view it as empowering, and we've sort of centered our life around it. That's why we're involved with so many museums. I do think it's well worth the investment. And as time investment that is, as Sarah Arison said, everything changed during COVID. The viewing rooms, the virtual viewing rooms, some of the online platforms for discovery, it's all really, really changed. And even apps like Live Art, you can see and track what's going on with artists and understand all their secondary market pricing in like a few taps of the phone. So the world has changed, and there's a lot of information out there. And then there's, of course, my favorite app, Instagram, because Instagram...
Thank God for Instagram.
Instagram is like the place of so much discovery and voyeurism, as we all know. So Instagram is a great platform as well to just discover visually appealing things. But I actually think spending time with artist studios, going to shows, can change your life beyond just looking at objects, but it's mind expanding and can create a new level of creative thinking that I certainly didn't have before I started collecting.
I always think it's the greatest privilege to spend time with artists. You all, I'm sure, are courted very often to sit on boards and institutions, and clearly you sit on a lot. I'm curious, what are the questions that you ask of the institutions?
So in my first board meeting at SF MoMA, I was the brashy, tech exec who had to show off. And so I said, well, we're talking about strategic plans and diversity. What are our KPIs? And so, of course, there was silence. And then there was a half an hour of conversation between Bob Fisher, our chair of the board, and Neil Ben Ezra, who was our director, trying to answer that question. And I said, well, all I mean is, how will it really influence your collecting in terms of actual numbers? What are you willing to commit to in 1 year, in 2 years, 5 years? How will things change on the walls? How will things change in the collection, etc., gifts? And then they realized that they didn't have an answer. And one of the things that Neil has then, ever since then, and now Chris, have always mentioned is the dashboard, right? So now we're really looking and using it as a compass in a way to understand where we are, but also as a way to level set where we want to go. I think that as a trustee, our job is to ask the hard questions, right? To certainly be very supportive, but to also ask hard questions. And we just had this long conversation with, the president and the chair and the director of the museum in terms of how do we chart out a long-term course for a museum where the city itself is not thriving. And so that's where we're all sort of ready to roll up our sleeves and help. But I think it's both the questioning the status quo, influencing what's going on. I'll say that as a collector, I feel that I've had the privilege of almost influencing institutions and influencing how they collect. And I continue to build the pressure on them by releasing books and now by doing a show focused on only women artists, but that as an actual structural change is what I'm hoping to achieve with institutions.
George?
So I really think about three things, like people, the mission of the organization, and then community. The first thing is people. I just have to like the people that I'd be interacting with. So whether it's a committee or a board, do I actually like the people? Do I want to spend a lot of time with them? We're all pressed for time, and I want to make sure that I'm building the relationships that make sense for me. So people is important. And the first museum that I got heavily involved with was the Whitney Museum, and they have the most amazing curatorial team. I think they have some of the most important shows. And I love American art. I love being American. I want to tell American stories. So I love that first, and that was my first love. And then there's the mission. Obviously, the Whitney focuses on telling American stories, and the Tate, I think the Tate is one of the most important institutions in the world, given its role, its historical role that it's played in the art world. And now that the North American curator, Christine Kim, is involved, I just am obsessed with Christine Kim.
Me too.
She's absolutely...
She's amazing.
We still share her at LACMA, though.
Yeah, her LACMA portrait show was groundbreaking, and it traveled to Spelman College, which is a sister college to Morehouse. So I had already sort of heard of her. I just joined just a few months ago, and she was basically stalking me. She was texting me. She had other people texting me, and I basically have 3 jobs, so I work 70 hours a week. That's not a lie. So I was like, I don't really know. I don't really want to get involved with something else. But then when I sat with her and I heard her vision for making the Tate's collection more inclusive, whether it's Black artists, Native American artists, Hispanic artists, and even disabled artists, which is something I didn't even think about, are all part of the mission on building the North American collection. And then, of course, she flouted my ego and said, do you want to be co-chair, which I was pretty shocked by. So I was like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. So that's why I got involved with the Tate. And then community, we are like living in the Hamptons. My husband lives there full time. I'm kind of back and forth, but just wanting to be involved with the Hamptons community, wanting to do something cultural in the summer because it's so void of that. Usually my summers in the Hamptons were filled with binge drinking and then going to bed.
Rosé and tennis.
Rosé and tennis. Cannot forget tennis or Soul Cycle. But so it's very enriching to go to openings and go to dinners and to be also thinking about art in the summer when you're trying to decompress for what's a very difficult life here in New York. So those are how I think about it when I get involved with art institutions.
So I hope somebody in the audience remembers this study, because there was a study done 7 or 8 years ago. And because I have mom brain, I can't remember who it was done by or the exact numbers, but it was something like 96% of the respondents said they supported the arts, and 25% of respondents said they supported artists. And I don't know about you, but I heard that and I say, don't they realize that the arts does not exist without artists? That it seems kind of an insane disconnect. And so for me, I really look at how are institutions serving artists. I think MoMA PS1 is a fantastic example. We are a truly artist-centric organization. They're not only to really serve artists and provide support and visibility at these really pivotal, critical junctures in their lives and careers, but also, you mentioned community. I think community is a huge part of it. Long Island City is the fastest growing zip code in the country. And how are we welcoming the community? How are we welcoming people who maybe, would not have thought to come to a cultural institution before? I think in the past there has really been an ivory tower aspect of cultural institutions. There are a lot of intimidation barriers, whether it's I don't know enough, I don't know I'm going to like it, the ticket price is too high. And so I look at institutions and think, who's really pushing the field forward? Who's really thinking about accessibility in terms of bringing new artists in, bringing new audiences in? I think Lincoln Center as well has done a phenomenal job. Henry Timms is a really brilliant leader. And in the past 2 years, over 60% of the audiences at Lincoln Center had never been to Lincoln Center before. And I think that, yes, and a lot of it has to do, again, one of the silver linings of COVID, we had to move all of our programming outside. We activated 10 outdoor campuses, all new artists, all across disciplines from all different communities here. And I think that really engaged a lot of different audiences and now made people feel like Lincoln Center was a place where they can come. It was a place that was theirs as well. So I am really excited to work with institutions that are thinking about accessibility, about expanding audiences, expanding artists, expanding opportunities, and breaking down those ivory towers and really breaking down those intimidation barriers that I think often exist in the arts.
I think they still exist, and I think
Yes.
it's very important that we all work incredibly hard to
Exactly.
break them down. I think I have about 9 more questions, but I think it's already time.
And you were worried we weren't going to have enough content.
But so I think we're going to open it up to questions. I will say that before we sat down, Komal said she wanted a provocative question, so I don't know if I gave her one or maybe the audience will, but I'd like to open it up to questions at this point.
First off, thank you for the talk. It was really engaging and interesting. It's great hearing all 4 of your experiences. I think I'm not a collector of art at all, and I'm not an artist. But something coming here that's been really interesting to me is to think about the difference between intrinsic value and valuation. And so something, that's sort of, I know it's kind of in some ways the least important thing about art, but something that's kind of underlying all the conversation here is how much things cost and how the prices increase with prestige of the artist and like the market attention, right? And so I think the question I'm trying to understand is, is there any relationship between pricing and the value of the message or the craftsmanship of the work? And maybe a thought question would be, let's say that, you guys are maybe you're driving out to the Hamptons or something, and you see like a little farmer's market, and there's an artist there, and they're like making some stuff, and you look at it and you're like, oh, actually this is pretty good. It's kind of provocative, it's well crafted, whatever medium they're using, and then you ask how much it costs, and they're like, oh, I don't know, like $50. Would you look at that and be like, holy crap, I just found something that I think has the same merit as something that's $250,000, right? Or do you look at it and say, well, there's no gallery backing this person. There's no museum that's looking for this person. This person's not plugged into this universe at all. And that often feels, at least from the outsider, that's kind of the discrepancy between, the 3 orders of magnitude in pricing. So just kind of wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that, if that question even is a question.
And go ahead.
I love valuations, so I'll take that question. It's interesting because so many of my friends, I'm a relatively young collector, and so many of my friends will see something in the Bahamas or they'll see something in a gallery and they'll say, should I buy this? And I'm like, well, who's showing the artist, right? Like the gallery that is showing the artist is a big validator. Is the artist in museum collections? That's also a barometer. Are they mentioned in the press? When you Google them, does stuff show up, right? And so I think that one should always just buy what you love. So $50 is a great example. Like, if you love something for $50, don't buy it because it looks like a Van Gogh, right? Because like it may never go up, but if living with it you feel changes your life, then buy it. If you want it to be valuable, museums have to think it's valuable, galleries have to think it's valuable, like collectors have to think it's valuable. And if that's not yet there, then there's a lot of risk to buying it. I'll also say that valuations shift all the time. So even an artist that's so hot and their prices are selling for $2 million today, it could be no interest tomorrow. So that's also why you have to buy what you love. It's because you never know what's going to happen. I've never sold a work. I bought some stuff with Lehman Maupin that I financed because I was like, I want to flip this for you guys. But I've never bought a work that we bought for our personal collection. I never sold a work that we bought for our personal collection just because I'm trying to amass a long-term story, my own story. But never compare visually something to another like cultural benchmark, like a well-known artist, or oh, this looks like a Basquiat, it's only $50, I'm gonna buy it. Don't do it, but buy it if you love it.
That's such a great answer. And I think the one thread here you'll see is how personal collecting is.
Well, I was going to say that there's a very fine young man, Jason Andrews, sitting over there, who represents the estate of Elizabeth Murray. And I'll give you an example here that she's an artist who has had incredible amounts of influence on younger artists, but also black artists. So Jack Whitten, for example, who passed away and was a very important black artist, loved Elizabeth's work, and he'd go to every show. Now, a dealer had sent me a tiny thumbnail of a work, which we now have in our collection, and I had no idea what it was, right? But one of the curators who I had asked for advice said, you should at least get it. I did, and the moment I saw it, without really knowing what she had done, I was so mesmerized, and that reaction was so strong, the work was so powerful, that to me that is what is important, right? That reaction. Now, valuation, as Greg was saying, can go up and down. I think that the truly great artists shine as well, right? So I think that reaction is super important. Then there are a lot of other factors at play, the ecosystem, but also is the work novel? How does it contribute to the canons of art? And all of those, but you have to really just fall in love with the work. I think that's most critical.
So you can go watch a documentary that I was executive producer on called The Price of Everything that I think addresses like a lot of what you're talking about and the kind of behind the scenes pricing of the art world, which is often very veiled. But my least favorite question, which I'm asked all the time, is, okay, so I want to buy some art. So tell me what in like 5 years is going to like quadruple in value. and I say, just like go buy a poster, frame it, and stick it on your wall, and go find a different place to put your money. Right. But I also kind of going back to that difference between like the arts and artists. There's a human being behind that work. There's an individual behind that work. You purchasing the work on the primary market is going to, in most cases, unless they're like astronomically successful, if I bought a Jeff Koons, it wouldn't affect Jeff Koons' life.
No talking about Jeff Koons, remember?
Banned from the panel.
But, if I'm buying an artist that's like straight out of university, maybe it's going to allow them to pay for their studio or their apartment for the next month. Them saying that the chair of the board of MoMA PS1 just purchased one of their pieces is going to really have an impact on their life and career. And so, and I think I think in my history I've bought maybe 2 pieces on secondary market because I think that so many artists, the secondary market really, they don't get any benefit from them, and it can often negatively impact them. But
do you think there should be artist unions, or do you think that artists deserve a royalty?
We didn't even get to talk
I
about
was
the
about to
secondary.
say, now we're talking Greek. Yeah, I mean, I think, and there have been some attempts to kind of figure out how a structure that can come about in the secondary market where the artists are at least getting a portion of what is happening, and I think that absolutely should happen.
So there was a Lehman Maupin artist who actually, when we started entering into an acquisition contract, wanted royalty. And I was, of course, very happy about it, because I firmly believe that we should have resale royalties in general. But then the dealer, Lehman Maupin, decided that it wasn't going to be enforceable, and also that it really didn't matter very much. And they actually were afraid of backlash from collectors. So I think that we're not ready, even though it's a very important thing to do.
Well, I think because it's still seen in many cases as a commodity, and as opposed to, you know, a human being behind it. That commoditization is still very much there.
I think that this could be the topic of our next panel, but I think that we also, like we all, I'm sure, I know I do, know artists, specifically in the last 5 years or 3 years, that have sold works for, let's say, under 30,000, that have gone at auction for over 700,000. I know 2 to 3 personally, and I think we can all agree that that doesn't feel fair. I have no idea how to fix that.
I think we're getting the time check, by the way.
Sorry.
They're going to pull
Okay,
out the hook
we're done.
soon. But basically, buy what you love. I think it's what we're all saying.
Yes. Do we have time for any more questions? Yeah. Okay, great.
Thank you. Yes, so you're all extremely lucky / you've worked hard to be collectors, and that's great. And you've all conscious collectors, right? Whether it's social justice, women, or the larger artist community. But what about making collecting art itself more accessible? How do we do that? Most people can't afford any piece of art. Artists, you mentioned Nari Ward. I love his work and what he's doing, working on poverty, social justice, but his art is not affordable to many. So there's a gap between the message of certain artists, of artistic institutions, and then the reality of who can actually collect. So how do we do this? How do we make art more affordable or accessible to some communities who could not even walk into this fair? Or maybe they can, but they can't. We're talking about barriers, right? They're afraid, they don't know, they're like afraid of gallerist attitudes, everything. So how do we make art more accessible, democratized, like the act of collecting?
Well, first I'll say, there are all types of mediums. So I collect prints, I collect photographs, I collect works on paper, and I collect paintings and sculpture. And even an artist like Nari Ward, there's artwork that you can get, editioned work, for $1,000. Now, that's not totally accessible, but it's a way to get your foot in the door on collecting. And then I also just think owning art is not the only way to have it enrich. There's so many people that I've come across at galleries, at museums, that know so much about art, much more than me, and they, at this time, can't afford to collect. And the reality is, I couldn't collect 6 years ago. I couldn't afford it. So things change. So I think it's just about learning, observing, trying to find works that you can afford, like edition works. But you're right, it is really hard, and it only seems to be getting more difficult to find accessible art.
The other thing that I would say, and I agree with you, and I think it's a really good question, is to think a little bit more broadly. What I find happens in the art world, and people come to me a lot with this complaint, is there tends to be a group of artists that are hot. And I always know of many other artists who are institutionally supported by good galleries, by institutions and good galleries, who aren't necessarily, call it market darlings of the moment, who should be supported. And while I'm saying maybe it's still under $20,000, which is still a significant amount of money, it is more accessible than some other people. So I think just kind of looking a little bit deeper, there are lots of amazing, amazing artists to still collect under 20,000.
I would say that there are so many artists who are looking for buyers, right? And so I think what we have is a mismatch, right? And to me, I think colleges and art schools are a great place to go look for talent. not saying that everybody is affordable or not, it's not a value judgment in any way, but I'm saying that there are other places. I mean, you are at a very rarefied place of art, of selling and buying art, right? And so, but there are lots of other venues and avenues that can bring joy as well, and that can support great artists.
Yeah, I was going to say the editions. I know some of the truly greatest collectors in the world started with prints and editions because they were really passionate, and that was kind of the way that they could collect and live with art. And I think the MFA programs, going to see the MFA shows, there's so going to a young arts exhibition. There are so many ways that you can see these emerging artists. Greater New York at MoMA PS1, it's there are all the Whitney Biennial. There are so many of these shows that are just looking for emerging talent, and that if you just kind of show up and go through, you're able to find them.
And the Spring Break Art Fair is a great
Yes.
place to find them too. I think it's still open today, right?
One more question?
Thank you. To exhibit our works or to sell them, if it will work.
I think the smaller galleries are always looking, obviously, for new talent. Like I said, some of these great group shows, like a Spring Break, like a Greater New York, and I think you're in the right place. You're in a building that's full of curators, full of gallerists, full of collectors. Getting out there and being open and meeting people is the best thing to do.
And take the time to work on your practice and elevate your practice and get critiques on your practice from curators, from people, from your fellow alumni. I think so many artists today want instant success because that's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing people graduate and we're seeing their careers, rise like rocket ships. But so many artists worked for 30, 40 years to perfect their craft. And I think look at it as an opportunity to get better and better.
Go ahead. Last one.
Thank you, first of all. And my question was kind of geared toward what you were talking about at the end of the talk. And I really appreciate how much you guys are thinking about the livelihood and careers of artists and being on museum boards. I was wondering, what do you think about the struggles of art workers in museums? I mean, we're seeing people not getting paid a living wage in museums. The Tate, they had that famous article that the head of coffee made more money than the head of curation. And we have, Whitney workers trying to unionize and Guggenheim workers trying to unionize and getting shut down every time. So I was wondering, what do you think about that? How do you reconcile that if you don't, or if that's even a discussion?
It's very much a discussion now. Unfortunately, cultural institutions we're not-for-profit organizations, and the impact that COVID had on all cultural institutions across disciplines was devastating. The impact that it had on artists was devastating. We're all still working to recover. We do realize the issue, though. A lot of museum workers are moving to galleries. They're moving to for-profit spaces. It's something that is very much a part of the discussion. It's something we're very, very much aware of, and it's trying to balance making sure that the staff is cared for, but also making sure that the institution can kind of keep its lights on. But it's definitely something that museum boards around the country are discussing. It's unfortunate that we're not Europe and we don't get a lot of government funding, which is a whole nother panel and a whole nother issue.
A lot of panels ahead of us.
But yeah, it's something that's definitely part of the discussion, and we want to make this ecosystem work for everybody.
So I do want to just shine a light on how museums get funded, right? So in very few cases, it's the government, right? But other than that, it's the trustees and sort of philanthropy, and then it's tickets, right? And so what has been a challenge for museums is to actually grow revenues, especially with COVID. And so every single museum is struggling, right? You've seen a lot of them raising prices. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not trying to justify anything at this moment. All I'm trying to say is that there are lots of factors at play. And I did not know about this coffee director versus the curatorial director comparison, but I will say that in most cases, most museums are looking at pay scales all the time. I totally agree that they are not where they should be, but I also think that museums themselves are a little strapped for funds at this moment.
Yeah, I agree. I think you look at a museum and you see $3 billion worth of art on the walls, but the reality is most of that art got there from gifts from patrons. And most museums, even the ones that are the most noteworthy, are actually struggling to balance budgets. But that doesn't move away from the fact that the salaries are jaw-droppingly low in many instances. I think a lot of museums are thinking about that, and I think there's much more to be done.
Well, thank you guys so much. What an honor to speak to you on this Sunday afternoon, and thank you for all that you do for the art world and all that you do to inspire artists and collectors. Thank you so much to the Armory for inviting us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
And thank you everyone for coming.